In the fall of 2003, Forbes Magazine ran a profile of Keith Raniere, the now imprisoned leader of the NXIVM cult. This article was hugely consequential. It ended up foreshadowing a lot of the events that would befall the cult in the coming 15 or so years until Keith was arrested and put on trial in 2018 and 19. The article also contained a lot of tropes and things that would become familiar in other pieces written about the cult. So it very much cast the die for how the public outside of the Raniere bubble would think of Keith and NXIVM. It had everything in there. It had the walking 12 miles a day with a bunch of women following him around, the most ethical and smart guy in the world, and all his weirdo claims from his biography, which he still kept on using after this for some reason, where he claimed to have been speaking in full sentences at the age of 1 and East Coast judo champ at 12. Lots of weird, funny stuff like that. Oh, Guinness Book of World Records, high IQ. So lots of funny little Keithisms sprinkled throughout the piece. It's my hypothesis that this article is actually hugely consequential. And I've known about it and looked into it for a while now, but it became a particular point of interest over the last couple weeks because there's been a lot of talk in the NXIVM case subreddit about this particular cover story and the mystery of why it's not available on the secondary market. I've been trying to buy a copy of it for years now and have not had much success. This minor mystery, the mystery of the missing October 2003 Forbes back issue, led me into a characteristically weird NXIVM wormhole, and I came out the other side with at least some answers about how this article was made and the importance of it, because it ended up showing up in all sorts of unexpected places as I looked over the chronology of how NXIVM unraveled from then. This 2003 Forbes article was the first major bad press for Raniere and his group. At the time, they were actually called the Executive Success Program. They were branded more towards training business people at how to be better at business. There's other groups like that, like the Landmark Forum. But right around the time this article came out, perhaps not coincidentally, we'll talk about more later, they rebranded to NXIVM, and NXIVM is actually mentioned towards the end of the article. It was also, in fact, the first major press at all. NXIVM or Executive Success Program, was very unknown at the time. It was only really ascendant in a few different spots. The group was always based in the Albany capital region of New York, but they had training centers in a few other spots, like in Seattle and in Mexico. It had taken hold. And actually, there was one up here in Alaska that we'll talk about a little bit too, as we get deeper into this weirdo mystery. Besides the potential rebranding of the group from ESP to NXIVM, this article may have also catalyzed a lot of other changes. It came at a really momentous time in terms of the personnel involved, the people in Keith's inner circle. The initial group of Keith's top lieutenants had just defected, and Keith was looking to replace them with figures like the Bronfman sisters, Sara and Clare. So another thing that tainted the name and marketing of ESP at the time was earlier that year, a woman named Kristen Snyder was taking one of ESP's courses, which is the major thing they offer, these long, intensive courses, up in Anchorage. And she died by an apparent suicide in a very bizarre and mysterious incident, which is chronicled in many places, including The Lost Women, the documentary that Frank Parlato did. This incident of Kristen Snyder having a terrible reaction to the intensive courses wasn't unique. There were many other people that had psychiatric breaks from these courses. The intensives last typically 5 to 14 days, thus intensive. And they went for 14 hours a day. And, they had these heated rooms and all these different things that were sort of designed to put people in an almost trance-like state, including all the weirdo babble that they were teaching in these classes and these different courses that were a mixture of a bunch of different sort of new age type philosophies, including neuro-linguistic programming, which was Nancy Salzman, prefect, the number 2 in NXIVM, was an expert in. Lots of different Scientology, especially the verbiage involved, suppressives and all this sort of stuff, was lifted wholesale. And as I mentioned earlier, the general outline of how the group, their business model worked, is similar to something like the Landmark Forum, which is another executive training program that has been compared to a cult. Because in the Landmark Forum, you can't go to the bathroom, although in ESP they let you do that. But they had all sorts of other weird customs, like sort of like a karate type system where you got like different colored sashes with many different grades. So the main issue for Keith in terms of the Snyder thing personally was he was like the version before the Keith that came to run NXIVM in the way that he sold himself to followers. At the time of VSP back in 2003, he was still saying that he was like this renunciate monk type person that didn't partake of the pleasures of the flesh, shall we say, in this world. But the Kristen Snyder story gave lie to that, because she had been in Albany before this intensive on a trip and met with Keith, and there's just rumors flying around that she may have been pregnant, which caused her to have the break, and she was in a committed relationship with another woman at the time up in Anchorage. So there's just all sorts of weird stuff going on there that didn't look good for Keith, and lots of rumors flying. If you want to know more about it, I actually happened to write a couple of articles for it a few years ago, so I'll put links to those in the description. It's a bizarre and interesting rabbit hole to fall down, but there's just a lot of different things like that that were causing a stir in the world of ESP/NXIVM, and this Forbes article dropped right in the middle of that. So coming into the frame from this period, Clare and Sara Bronfman had just joined ESP a couple years before this, in the early 2000s. And if you don't know their whole story, it's very, again, interesting. There's so many weird and interesting people involved with this group, which is one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by it. But they are heiresses to the Seagram's liquor fortune. So I think the father, Edgar, was worth somewhere around $2 or $3 billion at this point in time.
Clare Bronfman was born into one of the most prominent families in modern history. She had the means to live any way she wanted, anywhere she wanted. But of all the paths she could have taken, she took the path that led to her serving time in federal prison for her leadership role in NXIVM. This is how Clare and her sister Sara poured more than $100 million into one of the most notorious cults of the 21st century.
More importantly, as far as the group and Keith were concerned, though, they would also go on to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to Keith directly and to the group as well, buying stuff like their headquarters and jets and all sorts of different things, financing Keith's forays into the real estate and commodities markets, which is a nutty story on its own. And it brought a lot of people that would become familiar characters over the next 15 years into the orbit of Keith Raniere and NXIVM, including Frank Parlato, we mentioned earlier, who was central in bringing down the cult eventually. He was initially hired as like a PR guy to help clean up their issues from all of this brouhaha. At the time this Forbes article came out, Clare and Sara Bronfman were just becoming seriously enmeshed with the group. They hadn't really committed that much money to Keith or ESP/NXIVM, but that was sort of the fulcrum or the sticking point that caused the issues, and all was revealed in the reporting of this article by Forbes. So Clare and Sara's father, Edgar, another fascinating, weird guy, former head of like the Jewish Congress and mogul in many different areas, had some sort of guilty conscience about the Clare and Sara because they were the youngest of his kids. He sort of paid the least amount of attention to them. He had had a number of different failed marriages, and his marriage to their mother was also a weird and interesting rabbit hole to fall down. They've married twice, and it's just a crazy family. But they were sort of aimless at this time. They were in their early to mid 20s. Clare was into equestrian jumping. Sara was sort of a party girl. And so Edgar was initially supportive of these girls being involved in Keith's group. And he was also an early acolyte for a while. He used to fly out Nancy Salzman on a private plane to give him personal courses. So he really dug it and thought it was a good thing for the girls to give them some direction. But during the reporting of the Forbes story, Edgar Bronfman soured on Raniere and the group because of Clare, in what's described as a sort of like snit of jealousy, or she felt that she wasn't getting attention at the time, revealed Raniere had borrowed $2 million from her, and this was included in the story. And this also was the first major financial transaction. And so when Edgar learned of this, when the story was released, he saw the writing on the wall. And he also referred to the group. He said that he thought it was a cult in the actual story as well, which, because it was the first major story of any note on the group, sort of branded them with that label. And it was the first time in print anybody had referred to them as such. So beyond all this background that was known at the time the article was released in 2003, or much of it could have been inferred or was speculated about, we have a couple of very strong lines of evidence that this article was a major catalyzing event and caused some big rifts. Not only did it alienate Clare and Sara from their dad, but Keith, the Machiavellian scumbag that he is, sensed this particular weakness as the way he could set a permanent wedge between Clare and Sara and their father, and also make them feel indebted to him and like they had caused this whole thing in the first place. The first way that we knew this, and this evidence continued to pile up for the next 15 or so years until Keith's trial, was just all the other subsequent major articles that came out would almost invariably reference this Forbes article and give sort of updates on the status of the fallout from that article. Secondly, and more importantly in terms of the strength of the evidence, the Forbes piece itself was not only referenced in Raniere's trial, but it's sprinkled throughout the proceedings. If you look through the transcript, which I did, and collected examples of all the different times it was brought up. And there's some fascinating nuggets that came out in that trial that helped to answer at least some of the questions I had about this issue. This is a summary of all the interesting nuggets that I came across in the Keith Raniere trial transcripts. There's a lot of stuff in here that could be material for an entire video, so I don't want to get too in depth. But if there's anything that you see here, like the relationship between Clare and Keith and Clare and her dad, Edgar, or just any other subjects that you are interested in NXIVM or any of the other type of things I usually cover, true crime or cults, I guess, are the main ones, let me know in the comments. I'm always interested in viewer feedback, and I've made a number of videos based on people's suggestions, so always looking for that. Anyway, so we're going to start with Daniela, and Daniela was one of the women who was a victim of Keith Raniere. He abused her sexually, and he also used her as like forced work, doing all sorts of different administrative type tasks. In her, the first part of her transcript, 2549 is the transcript page number. She talks about how, she witnessed the reaction of Keith and his inner circle to when the Forbes article came out. And she says, when that article came out, yes, I remember they bought a lot of those magazines, like boxes. So on the next page of the transcript for Daniela, we see the beginnings of a very fascinating sidelight to this whole Forbes deal, which is that Daniela describes on this page that Keith Raniere told her to begin spying on Edgar Bronfman through his email account. Clare Bronfman had installed keylogger software on Edgar's computer, and so part of the forced labor that Daniela was assigned by Keith was keeping track of all of the emails coming into and out, all the traffic on Edgar's email, as Edgar was part of the NXIVM enemies list and a big part of the conspiracy that Keith cooked up to make Edgar's daughters, Clare and Sara, feel indebted to him. This is Fontanelli. He's an FBI man, I believe, federal agent of some kind. This is 1414 of the trial transcript page numbers. And in this one, Fontanelli describes to Prosecutor Penza that as he was going through Keith's home, as we described earlier, he found a library with tubs full of back issues of Forbes magazine. As he says in the beginning of this page, the only item of note was there was quite a large number of Forbes magazines contained in those particular bins. And then Penza asks to clarify, Forbes magazine that contained articles about, not about this case rather, but about NXIVM. That's correct. This is just another little quick item from a subsequent page where Agent Fontanelli is talking about files that he found at Raniere's, and he mentions a couple names that are notable in terms of this piece. Malcolm Stevenson Forbes, that's the owner of Forbes, and Michael Friedman, the author of the article, had files in Keith Raniere's enemies list. There's a lot of material about the relationship between Claire and her father, Edgar, and Claire and Keith and Nancy. And so a lot of that's contained in this Hurwitz testimony. Hurwitz was a guy who was friends with Edgar Bronfman, who Edgar brought in to try to help him with the issue with NXIVM and his daughters. So in this 11337, Hurwitz is just describing his role and how he was sought by Bronfman, Edgar Bronfman, to help with Rick Ross issues, because Rick Ross was also involved in ongoing litigation that lasted for over 10 years with NXIVM and the issues with his daughter. Ross became involved with the whole Bronfman angle because part of Keith's grand conspiracy is that Rick Ross was part of this cabal trying to take Keith down by ruining his commodities transactions, where he lost $60 million of the Bronfman sisters' money. That's another story. I thought this bit of testimony from Hurwitz was interesting because he, in the beginning of this page, 1354, he talks about how he evaluated what the sisters' allegations were on Rick Ross, the cult deprogrammer, and just basically told him, I don't see a there. This isn't anything we can deal with, I can deal with. But the other thing that's interesting is later down the page, he's referencing an email that Clare Bronfman sent to him about wanting to get Forbes or people involved with that 2003 Forbes magazine article in trouble. This was in 2008, so 5 years afterwards. A couple pages later on 1356, just a little extra gloss here, Hurwitz describes how Clare Bronfman had emailed him and wanted to get criminal charges against Rick Ross and the Forbes magazine people. Then on 1360 in the Hurwitz testimony, we have a really touching email from Edgar to his daughter Claire, where he talks, about how he's read her probably crazy email screed to him about the conspiracy and given a lot of attention, tried to fix the situation, but basically telling her and outlining that, no, I'm not a part of some grand conspiracy. I'm not funding Rick Ross. I'm not funding any sort of bad press. So it's just sort of a really sad, bittersweet note. One surprising place that the Forbes magazine article showed up a lot was in the closing arguments of this case. Penza, the prosecutor, talked about it a number of times, asked to use it as a demonstrative for her closing. On page 5328, she summarized the relationship breakdown between Edgar and Clare Bronfman over the Forbes article. She described how Keith forced Daniela to be keylogging and spying on Edgar after the Forbes article. Then she gets into some really complex, weird stuff involving a lawsuit where NXIVM sued one of its former intensive participants in Rick Ross because they were quoted in the Forbes article, and Keith ended up trying to sue them for years using this crazy scorched earth litigation technique where he tried to drain his opponents of money, spending tens of millions of dollars of the Bronfman money on it. Just to finish out here, Rick Ross, the boss, the cult deprogrammer, not the drug dealer, not the rapper who stole the drug dealer's name, but Rick Allen Ross, was a witness in the Raniere trial as well. It talks about how he was approached by Forbes, gave the writer background information about the whole cult world of NXIVM. Ross then on 4722 transcript number page says that part of the reason why Keith was suing him for over 10 years was because of this Forbes article. The physical magazine is actually produced, and Rick Ross IDs it with the Raniere story as the cover story. And then there's an argument made because the defense objects at one point on 4724 page number about the relevance, and that is only interesting to me because the prosecutor outlines the importance and relevance of the Forbes article as it pertains to this case, and the magazine is later entered into evidence. So in addition to all the other potpourri that we discussed about the Forbes article that came out at trial, the trial also featured the emails of Clare Bronfman, correspondence between her and Raniere and Nancy Salzman, the heads of NXIVM, and also on the sort of other side of that correspondence where Clare was communicating with her father. So we got a very intimate portrait that we really aren't afforded anywhere else in the NXIVM storyline, because we can hear it straight from Clare's mouth. And she's, I don't know if anybody's watched The Vow or anything like that, she's very dour and isn't the kind of person that gives interviews. Certainly not after the 2003 Forbes article, when her and Sara felt incredibly burned. But, we just never really got to hear her perspective otherwise. And this laid bare the entire context of the relationship and essentially buttressed what I described earlier, where Raniere used this opportunity of the 2003 Forbes article to really sink his claws into the sisters, because it was after that they started burning through their trust funds and giving Keith hundreds of millions of dollars. If it wasn't for the Bronfman sisters being super deep in the NXIVM cult and willing to part with much of their inheritance to allow Keith to hire armies of attorneys to harass his opponents and keep people locked in litigation and create a culture of fear and so on and so forth, it's certain that NXIVM would have ended much sooner than it did. So in a sense, this Forbes article had a weird unintended consequence of perhaps lengthening the lifespan of NXIVM and really adding the necessary fuel to the fire to allow it to become truly malignant. There are a couple of conclusions that I've reached in the case of the missing Forbes cover story. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot and keeps coming up again and again as I examine the weird worlds of cults. And I think the first conclusion that I want to talk about is that you have to be very wary of interloping in the affairs of cults. I know this myself because I did a series of videos on the cult of ex-cult members that was growing in the ex-Scientology world around the time of the Danny Masterson trial, and that was one of the craziest experiences I've had. Lots of nutty people, and I still don't really follow Scientology like I did before all of that because it was just so bizarre. But the real impetus of me saying this is that one of the ingredients that cults need to thrive and to really become huge groups with lots of different members is that they need an outsider or a perceived outsider who they think is trying to attack them or otherwise threaten the survival of the group. Or just the perception of such is enough. So, even if you don't have that intention, your foray into the world of cults could be used as that by the charismatic leader like Raniere to make the followers think that you're attacking them, and then they'll all galvanize around the leader. So there's just like a certain stew of elements that cults need to really become the groups that we really think of as cults. There's thousands of different groups that could be referred to as such, or new religious movements if you want to be academic about it. Or high control groups is another term. But if you just kind of look at the list of ingredients needed, like the charismatic leader, the inner group of followers, the outside force attacking them to galvanize them, you get some sort of idea of some of the pitfalls to avoid in dealing with cults. But it's so complex, and there's all these second and third order effects you couldn't possibly anticipate. One other thing that it really has made me think about this whole adventure into the sublime is that it's confirmed to me once again one of the reasons why I like to collect periodicals in the first place. And that's that they're a solid record of history. Although this whole thing was spurred on by the germ of me searching for an actual magazine, I have been forced to rely on the internet for the source of information about this issue. And I had to sift through like mounds of material to find anything resembling an answer. In particular, recently I had to go through the entire transcript of Keith Raniere's trial and talk to a bunch of very friendly folks at the NXIVM case subreddit who are subject matter experts and know all sorts of interesting stuff about the case. And it's a great subreddit to follow now, as there's a bunch of interesting stuff happening in the world of NXIVM, like Allison Mack has just started talking and Nancy Salzman, so things are kind of hot on the block. There were two nuggets of information that I had before all this that led me to assume certain things about this issue. One of them was at the trial. I had already known that in the transcript, there's a federal agent who talks about finding tubs of this back issue when he was raiding Keith's house, going through all of his stuff. And there had been rumors about that out there, but this was confirmed at Raniere's trial by a federal official. So we knew that they had tried to buy up all sorts of back issues. That's what led me to think, oh, this is probably why NXIVM themselves had cornered the market on all of the back issues, which is why you can't find one on eBay or anywhere else. That was my assumption. The second assumption that I had was that the cover featured an image of Keith Raniere. Forbes itself has tweeted out an image of this cover, and this 2003 Forbes article is often referred to as a cover story in other sources, including sources that are renowned for accuracy, like the Poynter Institute. At this point, I don't have it totally nailed down. I'm still waiting for confirmation from, I emailed like basically everybody on the masthead and then waiting to hear back from somebody. But it appears that there was actually two variants of the cover, like this was a Marvel comic book or something. There was apparently actually a version of this 2003 Forbes magazine, which did have Keith on the cover. Those issues, it appears, are indeed incredibly scarce on the secondary market, or at least I haven't been able to find one over the last few years. However, a kindly user in the NXIVM case subreddit informed me that there's actually another cover, and yet another user chimed in with some information that the version that had Keith on the cover was a regional New York variant that Forbes released for marketing purposes. The other version, which I did manage to obtain, has the most boring cover you can imagine about the best business schools. But it does contain this profile of Keith Raniere. I've scanned a copy and I posted it on the NXIVM case subreddit. There will be a link to it in the description in case you would like to peruse it for yourself. So the whole time, I was looking for an issue with the wrong cover. It's just thinking about like what historians will have to go through to report on this time period, like 20, 30 years from now, is kind of bleak, because everything has been atomized into all these different sources, like individual social media accounts, which don't really have a great record of staying online or being archived anywhere. That's why I am so invested in the idea of printed media, and why I have bangers boxes of it everywhere, old magazines, and why I'm sort of constantly trading in it on the secondary markets. It may be inconvenient and wasteful in some ways, but it also marks a permanent record that can't be easily altered or polluted by bad faith actors. So yeah, all of this basically started because I wanted to find this frickin' magazine and I couldn't, and it just caused me to be curiouser and curiouser about this 2003 Forbes profile of the Vanguard, Keith Raniere. I was really happy to learn that there is actually a Raniere cover variant, because the game is still very much afoot, my friends. And so if you happen to know where to find one of these, drop me a line, would you? I, for myself, am once again back into the NXIVM wormhole to see if I can find a giant Tupperware full of back issues somewhere.